what role does Israel play in all of this? Because obviously Iran has been incredibly antagonistic to Israel. Have the Israelis managed to apply a lot of pressure onto the United States because they're portraying the Iranians, quite rightly, as aggressors towards them? And that meant that the embargoes and sanctions have been harsher as a result.
I think, the Israelis, I mean, one of the interesting things about the recent protests is actually Iranian ire and anger is really being directed towards Saudi Arabia rather than Israel, which is quite striking. Normally, they would always blame Israel for everything. I mean, it's all like, knee-jerk reaction. And, for the Iranians, certainly the Iranians, and this is the fascinating thing. I mean, for the Iranians in the regime, Israel is an ideological problem. I mean, they try to describe it as a geopolitical problem. It isn't. It's an ideological problem. I mean, and they're constantly talking about, we're going to eliminate Israel. Israel will collapse. I mean, either in a sort of very passive aggressive voice or just an aggressive voice. I mean, it's one of the two. And obviously the Israelis are extremely, justifiably anxious about all this. So, I mean, I do think the Israelis at times have not helped their own cause. I don't think Netanyahu played it brilliantly. On the other hand, what they've been able to do is really play the bad cop to some in Europe who are the good cop. I mean, I think it's very much a sort of a combined effort, and they're able to keep the West's feet to the fire on this issue and remind them that, given they live in the region, they have a very serious stake on what happens. So I think in terms of intelligence, I think in terms of combating, certainly in proxies, I mean, basically the Israelis and the Iranians are already basically fighting in Syria. I mean, that's, these things already started. The Israelis play an absolutely pivotal role in basically keeping a light shone on this. And I think that's vital. I mean, and they're reminding the West that, you guys might be sitting back and thinking about, wonderful deals. But at the end of the day, we are the ones who have to pick up the pieces and pick up the consequences. So it has to be something that we can live with. And I think really during Obama's period, of course, the deals that were being addressed were not something really the Israelis felt comfortable with. I mean, Iranians as a whole, by the way, their relationship with Israel is much more, if I may say so, sort of relaxed. I mean, they don't have an issue with the Israelis. I mean, there's huge numbers of Iranian Jews, of course, and many of whom I have to say, are in Israel at the moment. There are strong cultural links. I mean, and I said to someone, I said, I think there are only two countries in the world, possibly three, that have this sort of obsession with Cyrus the Great. One is Iran, the other is Israel, and possibly America, by the way. But certainly in Israel, they're really sort of keen on Cyrus the Great. And there was a phone-in show many years ago, which was summed it up for me actually in some ways. And it was obviously Israeli, Persian television in Israel. And they were talking about Iran. And then they had this phone call from Iran, so everyone got a little bit tense, and the guy on the phone call actually started out quite aggressive on the phone call. You guys, where the hell, and all this. And I think the studio audience was a little bit, well, maybe we should cut this guy off. And basically the conclusion of this guy was, he sort of said, he said 2,500 years ago, Cyrus the Great liberated you lot from Babylon and said, when the hell are you going to send someone to liberate us from the current, And of course the whole thing and that sort of spilled over. And I thought it was a great sort of, the attitude in Iran among Iranians towards the Israelis is much less toxic than you'll find in the sort of, they're bored with the ideology, to be honest. And, they don't forget that actually, the relationship with Israel prior to the revolution was actually pretty positive.
That is such an interesting point. And I think it comes back to I was going to ask you something about, because people say to me, well, you're from Russia. Surely, the Russian people are going to get fed up of Vladimir Putin and overthrow him and install brilliant, wonderful liberal democracy. And I'm like, why? Why would they do that? They've never had democracy in the entire history of the country. They've never had this thing that they're supposed to be aspiring to now. But with Iran, it sounds like actually there was a history of things it wasn't an Islamic republic of the type that it is now before. So how likely is it that, these protests are successful in forcing genuine change and transformation, and you get a leap of some kind, forward, backwards, left, right, whatever, in a different direction, where you end up with an Iran that has a completely different posture towards the world and is welcomed back into the international community?
Well, that's a really good. I mean, that's a really good point, in the sense of, what are the prospects for change in Iran in that sense. And as you say, if you look at the Russian experience, the transition to democracy is never something that should be taken for granted, and these are difficult. What I would say is this, of course. First of all, I'd say that culturally, Iran has a very, very positive. There's a receptive audience in the West. Let me put it that way. I mean, there's no doubt. Actually, to be honest, I usually say to the Iranians, just allow people to call you Persia, and you'll find actually that branding is going to work wonderfully. And all people will talk about is carpets and caviar, cats, and this sort of thing. And you'll immediately soften your image. But I use that sometimes with students also, just to point out, how word association, how important it is in a way, and how branding is important. Because also to point out, in the West, if you talk about these things, there are positive connotations of that, and people will sort of build on it. Now, in the political sense, and this is something I have been harping on about really, is that, a lot of people will be fighting the last revolution, of course, and looking at 1979 as the model for anything going forward. I've said that actually what people really need to look at is 1906. And 1906 was Iran's constitutional revolution, which set up, basically a parliamentary system on the British model. Okay. And it, obviously it didn't work in the long term, but it set the template. And this is important. It set a reference point for every subsequent political movement. And even to this day, younger people come up and they say, what happened to the aspirations of that movement, of that revolution in 1906? Why have we not promised, why has that promise not been delivered? And I think that's in some ways quite important. I'm one of these people, I'm one of these historians, I have to say, who actually believes in the power of ideas to change things. And yes, it can take a long time for these ideas to seep in. And yes, it can take, it can have a troubled journey, if you can put it that way. But the fact is, one of the things about the current movement is that, 15 years after probably the most systematic, root and branch suppression that occurred in Iran after the Green Movement in 2009, a whole new generation of Iranians have come up, many of them teenagers, by the way, expressing exactly the same views in a way of a previous generation, and talking about rights. People say it's about the veil. It's not about the veil. It's about the right to choose. If you want to wear the veil, wear it. If you don't want to wear the veil, don't wear it. But it's a fact that people in Iran, men, women, Baha'is, religious minorities of other sorts, whatever you want to talk about, ethnic minorities, have rights that protect them, and have civil and human rights. And these are very, very fundamental ideas, that come, I think have been best achieved in a way and expressed in a Western context, but certainly have deep, deep roots in many different cultures. And were expressed very clearly, 100 years ago. And the fact that they were expressed very clearly 100 years ago in Iran shows that they have deep roots, and it's difficult to eliminate that. Successive regimes have not been able to get rid of it, and people have aspired to it. So while I think that the road ahead is going to be a difficult one, I'm encouraged by the fact that there is this political awareness among this new generation of Iranians, which is very impressive. And they've sort of learnt, in a sense, from the legacy of the past, which is the torch has been handed on, and it's not going to go anywhere. So, ultimately, I think, there is an opportunity. The key really for the West is not to look a gift horse in the mouth. I mean, the West has a terrible, terrible reputation for dropping the ball, on almost every occasion. So if, for instance, Iran does move towards a secular system of government and a democratic settlement, I should say, that suits its own indigenous sort of culture, I don't want to, prescribe anything for them, whatever in that sense, but let's say a secular republic of some sort, I think it will be transformative in the region in terms of Iran's relations with the West, in Iran's international standing. And this is something that the West, at the very least, should not obstruct. I put the bar very low there, by the way. But, even if we're not saying encourage, and I think it should encourage it, but what it shouldn't do is obstruct it. And, there are strong parallels here again with the Ukrainian situation, where we found, if you remember, right at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, a number of European countries, very cynical, very skeptical. Do we really want to get into this? Can't the Russians just get this done quickly? Can we just move on? And so on and so forth. Again, what I say to people about the current protests in Iran is we don't know. I don't know where it's going to go. I mean, anyone who says they can predict it, nonsense. But I wouldn't dismiss it so quickly either. I mean, that's the key. don't be so quick to dismiss it. These people are showing enormous courage. And, I think they should be, respected for that. And they should be given the space, in a sense, to try and achieve those aims that, most of us in the West take for granted.